can a soldier go to war without ever firing a weapon and still become one of the most decorated heroes of his time? During the World War II, that unlikely scenario became reality. This video tells the story of Desmond Doss, a U.S. Army combat medic who refused to carry a gun because of his religious beliefs, yet repeatedly risked his life on the battlefield to save others. In one of the most intense battles of the Pacific, he would rescue dozens of wounded soldiers under enemy fire without any means of defense. This is not just a war story. It is a historical account of conviction, discipline, and action under extreme conditions. World War II was more than a military conflict between nations. It represented a clash of ideologies, political systems, and worldviews that reshaped the 20th century. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 70 million people died, and virtually every continent was directly or indirectly affected by the war. The conflict began with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, but it quickly expanded into a global war. In Europe, large-scale ground battles redrew borders and destroyed entire cities. In the Pacific, the confrontation between the United States and the Empire of Japan led to combat on remote islands, where geography and climate were as dangerous as the enemy. The United States entered the conflict after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This event completely transformed the strategic landscape, prompting the country to mobilize millions of men and women for the war effort. Within this context of mass mobilization, a specific category of individuals emerged, the so-called conscientious objectors. It is estimated that more than 70,000 Americans were classified this way during the war. These men, due to religious or moral convictions, refused to participate directly in acts of violence. However, this refusal did not necessarily mean a lack of participation. Many of these individuals chose to serve in non-combat roles, such as medics, nurses, and chaplains. They were present on the battlefield, facing the same risks as armed soldiers, but with a different mission: to save lives, not take them. It is within this group that the figure of Desmond Doss emerges. His story stands out not only because of his position as a conscientious objector, but also because of how he acted in one of the most violent theaters of the war. Doss did not merely take part in combat, he was on the front lines, under constant enemy fire. The fundamental difference is that he did so without ever carrying a weapon. This characteristic alone places him in a unique position in military history, but what truly sets his story apart is the direct impact of his actions. While most stories of military bravery are associated with neutralizing the enemy, Doss's story is tied to the preservation of life under extreme conditions. He operated in environments where seconds made the difference between life and death, often under intense bombardment, machine gun fire, and artillery attacks. In the Pacific Theater, in particular, conditions were especially severe. Japanese forces employed highly sophisticated defensive tactics, including tunnel networks, camouflaged positions, and resistance to the last man. This made every advance extremely costly for American troops. Battles, such as the Battle of Okinawa, exemplify this type of combat. Considered one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, Okinawa was marked by prolonged fighting, high casualties, and the extensive use of natural fortifications. It was in this environment that Desmond Doss served. But to fully understand his actions during the war, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, to his upbringing, his family, and the values that shaped his decisions. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in the city of Lynchburg, in the state of Virginia. His family lived in a working-class area, marked by simple routines, manual labor, and a strong sense of community. His father, William Thomas Doss, was a carpenter who had served during World War I. His mother, Bertha Edward Doss, fulfilled multiple roles. She managed the household, worked in a shoe factory, and was directly responsible for her children's religious upbringing. This point is central. His mother's influence was decisive in shaping Doss's value system. Bertha was an active member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a Protestant denomination that emphasizes strict adherence to biblical principles, including Sabbath observance, moral discipline, and above all, the sanctity of life. Unlike a superficial religious upbringing, the teachings within the Doss household were embedded in daily life. It was not merely about attending church, but about living according to those principles. This included practices such as dietary restrictions, rejection of alcohol consumption, and a clear stance against violence. One of the most frequently cited episodes in Doss's formation involves a framed copy of the Ten Commandments that his father brought into the home. Each commandment was accompanied by an illustration. The one that impacted young Desmond the most was the depiction of "Thou shalt not kill," illustrated by the biblical scene of Cain and Abel. For a child, this image had a profound effect. It was not merely symbolic, it was a concrete representation of violence between brothers. Doss began to reflect on that scene repeatedly, questioning how someone could take another person's life, especially someone close. These reflections did not remain abstract. They began to shape his practical perception of the world. Even at a young age, Doss developed a direct association between violence and moral rupture. For him, killing was not simply wrong, it was a fundamental violation of ethical order. Another important episode reinforced this perception. His father, who had returned from the war with clear signs of psychological trauma, struggled to cope with his experiences. On one occasion, during a family argument, he picked up a gun and pointed it at a relative. The situation could have ended in tragedy, but it was contained by his mother, who intervened, took the weapon, and called the authorities. Afterward, she asked her son to hide the revolver. Young Desmond obeyed, but the impact of that moment was lasting. Seeing his own father, a figure of authority, lose control under emotional strain and in the presence of a weapon, further solidified Doss's rejection of lethal instruments. This episode reinforced the idea that weapons not only take lives, but also intensify moments of instability. During adolescence, these values began to translate into concrete actions. Doss showed interest in activities focused on helping others. He participated in community initiatives, assisted neighbors, and volunteered in times of need. He also sought practical training. He completed courses related to first aid and rescue techniques, including flood rescues. These skills, acquired years before the war, would later play a crucial role in his actions on the battlefield. Another relevant aspect was the economic context. The Doss family experienced the effects of the Great Depression, a period of severe economic downturn that affected millions of families in the United States. As a result, Desmond had to leave formal schooling after the 8th grade to help support the household. He began working at the Lynchburg Lumber Company, where he developed manual skills and professional discipline. Later, he secured a job as a carpenter at a shipyard in Newport News, an occupation directly tied to the naval industry. This detail is important because it places Doss within the context of the war effort even before his enlistment. Ship production was essential to American military logistics, especially in the Pacific Theater. Therefore, his contribution already existed, albeit indirectly. However, despite being engaged in what was considered a strategic role, Doss did not see his participation as limited to the industrial environment. For him, the duty to serve his country could take another form, one aligned with his principles. It is at this point that his trajectory begins to diverge more clearly. Unlike many young men of his time, who viewed military service as a natural extension of patriotism, Doss faced a specific dilemma: how to participate in a war without violating his most fundamental convictions. The answer he found was not immediate, but rather built over years of moral formation, personal experiences, and practical development. And that answer would begin to take shape when the United States officially entered World War II. The entry of the United States into World War II, following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, triggered an unprecedented mobilization. Millions of men were drafted or volunteered to join the armed forces. The country rapidly expanded its military structure, creating new divisions and intensifying troop training for operations across multiple theaters of war. It was in this context that Desmond Doss received his draft notice in April 1942. At 23 years old, he was already working at a shipyard in Newport News, an occupation considered essential to the war effort. For this reason, he was eligible for a deferment from military service. Even so, he refused that option. His decision to enlist was not driven by a desire for combat, but by a sense of responsibility. Doss believed he could contribute to his country, as long as it did not involve taking lives. This distinction is fundamental. His entry into the army did not represent a change in values, but rather an attempt to apply them in a new context. He was inducted at Camp Lee, Virginia, and later sent to Fort Jackson, where he began basic training with the 77th Infantry Division, a unit that would be deployed to the Pacific. From the very first days, Doss made his position clear: he would not carry weapons. This declaration, within a military environment preparing for war, was met with immediate resistance. The United States Army already had guidelines for conscientious objectors, but these were not always applied uniformly. Many officers viewed such a stance as incompatible with military discipline. To them, a soldier who refused to bear arms represented a potential risk to the unit. Initially, Doss was classified as a conscientious objector. However, unlike other cases, he refused to be transferred to roles completely removed from combat. His position was specific. He wanted to serve on the front lines, but as a medic. This stance created a deadlock. From an institutional standpoint, it seemed contradictory that someone would want to be in combat without accepting its basic premises. As a result, the decision was made to keep him in standard infantry training, possibly with the expectation that he would give in under pressure. And that is exactly what began to happen. During training, Doss faced constant hostility from both peers and superiors. Many soldiers interpreted his refusal to carry weapons as cowardice or an attempt to avoid risk. This perception created an environment of isolation within the unit. Accounts indicate that he was frequently the target of insults, harassment, and even physical aggression. At night, while praying beside his bed, some fellow soldiers would throw objects at him, including boots and equipment. These actions were intended to pressure him into abandoning his stance or requesting a transfer. There was also formal resistance within the chain of command. One of his officers threatened him with a court-martial for insubordination, arguing that his refusal to handle a rifle violated basic regulations. In another incident, a superior tried to physically force him to hold a weapon, pushing a rifle against his body. Doss simply let it fall to the ground without reacting aggressively. This type of response, firm, yet non-confrontational, became a consistent trait of his behavior. Another significant moment occurred when he was denied leave to visit his brother, who was about to depart for the Pacific. The decision was later reversed after external intervention, but the episode highlights the level of tension between Doss and his superiors at that time. Despite all the pressure, he did not change his position. This point deserves particular attention. In a highly hierarchical environment like the military, maintaining a stance that runs counter to dominant expectations requires not only conviction, but also psychological resilience. Doss not only held his ground, but continued to fulfill all other duties with discipline. He took part in exercises, followed operational orders, and demonstrated adequate performance in required activities, except those involving the use of weapons. This combination of discipline and selective refusal gradually began to change how he was perceived. While there was still distrust on one hand, there was also a growing recognition that his stance was not rooted in a lack of commitment. Over time, his insistence on maintaining his position, combined with his fulfillment of other responsibilities, led to an administrative shift. Doss was finally assigned to the unit's medical corps, a role more aligned with his convictions. He became part of the medical detachment of Company B, 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, within the 77th Division. This role would place him directly on the battlefield, responsible for providing first aid, evacuating the wounded, and operating under combat conditions. However, even after this assignment, the challenges did not completely disappear. Perceptions within the unit were still evolving. Many soldiers remained skeptical about his ability to operate under enemy fire without carrying weapons. To them, the theory had yet to be tested in practice. That validation would only come once the unit was deployed into real combat. In March 1944, the 77th Division began its movement to the Pacific. After a period of preparation in Hawaii, it embarked toward conflict zones, where it would take part in operations on islands heavily defended by Japanese forces. From that point on, the training environment would give way to the reality of combat. And it would be in this new setting, where decisions must be made in seconds and consequences are immediate, that Doss's stance would cease to be a theoretical issue and become a concrete operational factor. When the 77th Infantry Division was finally deployed to the Pacific Theater in 1944, the conflict had already reached a decisive phase in that region. U.S. forces had adopted a strategy known as island hopping, which consisted of capturing strategic positions without necessarily conquering every area occupied by Japan. The objective was to advance progressively toward Japanese territory, establishing air and logistical bases along the way. It was in this context that Desmond Doss entered a real combat environment for the first time. Before being sent directly into the war zone, the division underwent a period of intensive training in Hawaii. There, soldiers were prepared for amphibious operations, jungle warfare, and adaptation to extreme climatic conditions. Unlike training in the United States, this phase aimed to simulate the environment they would encounter on the Pacific Islands' intense heat, high humidity, rugged terrain, and limited visibility. For Doss, this period carried additional meaning. For the first time, he was surrounded by men who would soon depend directly on his performance in real-life, high-risk situations. The atmosphere still carried remnants of the initial distrust, but now there was a new element: expectation. His combat debut took place on the island of Guam, one of the main strategic positions in the Central Pacific. The invasion was part of the Mariana Islands campaign, which aimed to establish bases for aerial bombardments against Japan. The Battle of Guam was marked by intense resistance from Japanese forces. Unlike conventional engagements, the enemy relied on tactics based on deep defense, caves, tunnels, camouflaged positions, and surprise attacks. This made the advance of American troops more difficult and significantly increased casualties. It was in this environment that Doss began to demonstrate, in practice, what had until then been only a conviction. As a combat medic, his role was not to remain in the rear. On the contrary, he operated close to the front lines, accompanying the infantry's advance. This meant constant exposure to machine gun fire, artillery shrapnel, and mortar attacks. In Guam, accounts indicate that Doss repeatedly moved under enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. His actions followed a consistent pattern. Locate the wounded, quickly assess the severity, administer first aid, and when possible, move them to a safer position. This process required not only technical skill but also rapid decision-making. In many cases, the time available for intervention was extremely limited. Hemorrhages, trauma, and burns had to be treated immediately to increase the chances of survival. Additionally, the terrain made rescue operations more difficult. Dense vegetation, combined with rocky areas and elevated positions, made transporting the wounded a physically demanding task. Often, Doss had to carry soldiers over long distances under constant risk. An important factor is that, unlike other medics, he did not carry a weapon for personal defense. This made him more vulnerable in direct combat situations. Even so, he maintained his position, prioritizing care for the wounded. As the days passed, his actions began to directly impact the perception of the troops. Soldiers who had previously viewed him with distrust began to recognize his operational value. It was no longer an ideological issue, but a matter of concrete results. Wounded men were surviving because of his intervention. This recognition was reinforced by specific rescue episodes under extreme conditions. In some situations, Doss advanced into areas still under active fire to reach fallen comrades. This type of action, involving high risk, began to draw greater attention from officers. As a result, he received his first Bronze Star Medal, accompanied by the V device, which indicates valor in combat. This distinction was not awarded routinely, but for actions demonstrating courage beyond what was expected in dangerous situations. After the capture of Guam, the 77th Division was not completely withdrawn from the theater of operations. Instead, it was redirected to another significant campaign: the liberation of the Philippines. The operation in the Philippines held high strategic importance. The archipelago was crucial for controlling maritime and air routes in the Pacific. Moreover, its recapture carried symbolic value for the United States, which had lost control of the region early in the war. The division landed on the island of Leyte in November 1944. As in Guam, Japanese forces offered intense resistance, using terrain and fortifications to slow the American advance. During this campaign, Doss maintained the same pattern of action observed earlier. His routine consisted of accompanying the infantry's advance, providing immediate care to the wounded, and organizing evacuations under adverse conditions. The fighting in Leyte was particularly difficult due to weather conditions. Heavy rains turned the terrain into mud, hindering movement and increasing the physical effort required for any operation. In addition, constant humidity favored disease, increasing the workload of medics. Even in this scenario, Doss continued to act consistently. On several occasions, he was responsible for stabilizing soldiers in critical condition, ensuring they reached more structured medical units alive. His actions in the Philippines earned him a second Bronze Star, again with the WWII device. This reinforces an important point. His actions were not isolated, but repeated across different operations. By the end of these campaigns, perception within the unit had changed significantly. The soldier who had once been seen as a problem was now considered an essential asset. His presence on the battlefield increased the chances of survival for the wounded, directly impacting troop morale. This factor is often underestimated, but it holds great relevance in wartime contexts. Knowing that there is someone willing to risk their own life to rescue comrades changes how soldiers face combat. However, despite all this recognition, Doss's journey had not yet reached its most critical point. The experiences in Guam and the Philippines served as preparation, both technical and psychological, for what was to come. Because in 1945, the war in the Pacific was approaching Japanese territory, and with that, the intensity of combat would reach a new level. At the beginning of 1945, the war in the Pacific entered its most critical phase. After years of gradual advances across strategically important islands, United States forces were closing in directly on Japanese territory. The next objective was the island of Okinawa, a position of immense logistical and military value, located roughly 500 kilometers from mainland Japan. The Battle of Okinawa, which began in April of that year, would become one of the most intense and prolonged campaigns of the entire Pacific conflict. Unlike previous operations, Okinawa had a large civilian population and a deeply structured defensive system built by Japanese forces. The Japanese command, led by General Mitsuru Ushijima, adopted a distinct strategy. Instead of attempting to repel landings on the beaches, as had been done in earlier battles, they chose to withdraw inland and establish defensive lines in depth, using the terrain to their advantage. These defenses included networks of tunnels, interconnected caves, concealed artillery positions, and camouflaged machine gun nests. The objective was to wear down American forces as much as possible, prolonging the battle and increasing casualties. It was in this context that Desmond Doss arrived with the 77th Infantry Division. Before entering the main line of combat in Okinawa, the division took part in a series of preliminary operations on smaller surrounding islands. These actions aimed to secure strategic positions and prepare the ground for the main advance. Only at the end of April 1945 was Doss's unit deployed to the central sector of the island, where it would face one of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire Japanese defensive system, the Maeda Escarpment. Known among American soldiers as Hacksaw Ridge, this location was an extremely challenging geographical formation. It was a steep escarpment approximately 100 meters high, with sheer faces and limited access. At the top, Japanese forces had established fortified positions with wide visibility and well-defined fields of fire. From a tactical standpoint, the position offered a significant advantage to the defenders. Any attempt to climb exposed attackers to direct fire from machine guns, mortars, and light artillery. Capturing this position was essential for the advance of American troops toward the southern part of the island, where the main Japanese command center was located. On April 29, 1945, Doss's unit was assigned the mission of scaling the escarpment and establishing a foothold at the top. To accomplish this, cargo nets, similar to those used in amphibious operations, were employed, allowing soldiers to climb the cliff face. Doss was among the volunteers responsible for the initial ascent and for helping secure these nets. This detail is important because it shows that, despite his role as a medic, he did not avoid dangerous tasks. On the contrary, he actively participated in operations whenever necessary. The ascent was carried out under constant tension. Even before reaching the top, the soldiers were already under threat of attack. Once at the summit, the situation escalated rapidly. Japanese forces opened heavy fire on the newly established positions. Machine guns placed at elevated points, along with mortars and light artillery, began striking the area, turning the terrain into an active battlefield. The initial advance met strong resistance. American troops attempted to establish positions, but were quickly pressured by the intensity of enemy fire. It was at this moment that Doss's role began to stand out more clearly. While many soldiers sought cover to avoid the constant barrage, Doss moved among the wounded. His priority was clear: to stabilize as many men as possible under those conditions. He operated without significant protection, often in exposed areas. This increased the risk but also allowed him to reach those in immediate need more quickly. The dynamics of combat at Hacksaw Ridge were particularly complex. Japanese positions were concealed within caves and tunnels, making it difficult to identify the origin of incoming fire. This meant danger could come from multiple directions, often without warning. Additionally, the uneven terrain made both movement and evacuation of the wounded extremely difficult. In many cases, injured soldiers remained exposed for long periods before they could be reached. Doss began to establish a pattern of action similar to what had been observed in previous campaigns, but on a much more intense scale. He moved from one point to another, quickly assessing each wounded soldier. He applied bandages, controlled bleeding, and when possible, organized their removal to less exposed areas. However, the pressure of combat increased rapidly. Faced with mounting losses and the difficulty of holding positions at the top of the escarpment, American command ordered a temporary withdrawal. Soldiers began retreating down the nets, descending back to the base. It was at this moment that one of the most important decisions of Doss's entire trajectory took place. Realizing that many wounded had been left behind, unable to move on their own, he chose to remain at the top of the escarpment. This decision was not the result of a direct order, but of his own assessment of the situation. For Doss, abandoning those men was not an option. While most of the unit withdrew, he remained alone in an area still partially under Japanese control. This created an extremely dangerous situation. Isolated, without direct support and unarmed, Doss began operating in an environment where any movement could lead to contact with the enemy. Even so, he initiated a systematic rescue process. Using the available ropes and cargo nets, he began dragging the wounded to the edge of the escarpment. From there, he improvised a method to lower them to the base, where they could receive more complete medical care. This process required significant physical effort. Each soldier had to be moved individually, carefully positioned, and safely lowered. Time was also a critical factor. Remaining in the same area for extended periods increased the risk of detection by Japanese forces. Nevertheless, Doss continued the operation. Accounts indicate that he repeated this procedure over the course of hours, working almost without interruption. During this process, a phrase became constant in his thoughts, a simple request to save just one more. This pattern, rescuing one man at a time, continuously transformed an isolated act into a prolonged evacuation operation under combat conditions. By the end of this period, dozens of soldiers had been removed from the top of the escarpment alive. The most widely accepted estimate points to around 75 men rescued, although Doss himself cited lower numbers at different times. Regardless of the exact figure, the operational impact of his actions was significant. Soldiers who, under normal circumstances, would have been considered lost were recovered and successfully evacuated. This episode marked a definitive turning point in how Doss was perceived within his unit and in the recognition of his actions at higher levels of military command. However, the Battle of Okinawa was far from over, and the days that followed would bring new confrontations, even more intense, in which Doss would continue to operate under extreme conditions. After the initial episode at the Maeda Escarpment, known as Hacksaw Ridge, the tactical situation in Okinawa remained extremely unstable. The Battle of Okinawa was far from decided, and American forces continued to face organized resistance, with frequent counterattacks and extensive use of fortified positions. For Desmond Doss, the period that followed did not represent a pause, but rather the continuation of a high-risk operational environment. In the days following the large-scale rescue at the top of the escarpment, his unit was once again deployed in offensive operations. The objective remained the same: to break through Japanese defensive lines and advance toward the southern part of the island, where the main enemy positions were concentrated. A relevant detail at this point concerns the calendar. One of the subsequent attacks took place on a Saturday, a day considered sacred by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to which Doss belonged. Under normal circumstances, he avoided any activity during this period. However, given operational necessity and the shortage of medical personnel, he chose to accompany his unit. Before the advance, he requested just a few minutes for prayer. The request was granted. This episode, though simple, illustrates how Doss reconciled his convictions with the demands of the military environment, not through total refusal, but through pragmatic adaptation without abandoning his principles. When the attack began, American troops once again encountered heavy opposition. Japanese artillery, combined with machine guns and mortars, created a level of fire saturation similar to, and at times greater, than what had been previously observed. During this advance, an officer responsible for coordinating artillery support was severely wounded in an exposed position. The role of this type of officer was critical. He served as the link between ground troops and artillery batteries, adjusting indirect fire. The loss of such a figure could compromise the unit's support capabilities. Upon recognizing the situation, Doss quickly moved to the location. This required crossing an area under active fire with a direct risk of being hit. Upon reaching the officer, he carried out initial procedures: bleeding control, basic stabilization, and movement to a position with reduced exposure. This type of action highlights a recurring pattern. Doss did not limit his work to safe or partially secured areas. He operated directly in critical zones, where response time was decisive. Despite localized advances, fighting remained intense throughout May 1945. It was within this context that the episode resulting in his most serious injuries occurred. On May 21, during a tactical movement, his unit came into direct contact with Japanese forces in a relatively confined area. The engagement quickly escalated into close-quarters combat, with frequent use of hand grenades. Doss was positioned alongside other soldiers when a grenade landed near the group. Faced with the situation, he attempted to kick the explosive away, a reflexive reaction, given the extremely limited time available. The grenade detonated shortly afterward. The explosion had immediate effects. Doss was thrown to the ground and sustained multiple injuries caused by shrapnel. Reports indicate that approximately 17 fragments became lodged in his body, primarily affecting his legs and lower region. The blast also caused momentary disorientation. In situations like this, many soldiers were rendered incapacitated or required immediate evacuation. However, Doss remained conscious. He was placed on a stretcher by medics who began the evacuation process. This procedure followed previously defined routes, generally under moderate risk, but still subject to enemy attack. During the evacuation, another soldier was identified with more severe injuries. At that moment, a decision occurred that would become one of the most frequently cited examples of his conduct. Doss asked to be taken off the stretcher, allowing the other man to be evacuated in his place. This decision was not isolated, but consistent with the pattern observed throughout his service. Even while wounded, he maintained priority on treating others. After giving up his place, he remained on the ground awaiting another evacuation. It was during this interval that a second event worsened his condition. While exposed, he was struck by a sniper's bullet, resulting in a fracture to his left arm. The impact caused significant bone damage, making any movement difficult. At this point, Doss had multiple injuries, shrapnel wounds, and a severe arm fracture. Even so, he took an initiative that demonstrates not only physical resilience, but also the ability to adapt under pressure. Using a rifle abandoned on the battlefield, he improvised a splint to immobilize his injured arm. This procedure, though basic, was essential to reduce pain and prevent further injury during movement. He then began to withdraw on his own. Crawling across the terrain, he covered a considerable distance estimated at hundreds of meters until he reached American lines. This movement was carried out under adverse conditions, including uneven ground and continuous risk of enemy fire. Upon reaching a safe area, he received initial medical treatment and was later evacuated to a field hospital. This sequence of events: explosion, multiple injuries, refusal of priority evacuation, a second wound, and self-directed withdrawal represents one of the most critical moments of his trajectory. From an operational standpoint, his departure from the battlefield occurred only when he was no longer physically capable of continuing. Even then, his conduct remained consistent until the very end, an absolute priority on the care of others, regardless of personal risk. After evacuation, Doss was transferred for more structured medical treatment, initially at facilities in the Pacific and later in the United States. The battle in Okinawa would continue for weeks after his departure, concluding only in June 1945, with heavy casualties on both sides. However, the actions carried out by Doss during this period had already been recorded and reported by officers and fellow soldiers in his unit. With the end of the most intense operations in the Battle of Okinawa, the actions carried out by Desmond Doss began to be formally evaluated within the structure of the United States military. Unlike the informal recognition among his fellow soldiers, which had already been established during combat, this process involved specific criteria, detailed documentation, and validation at multiple levels of the chain of command. The U.S. military decorations system follows a hierarchical structure. At the top is the Medal of Honor, intended to recognize acts of bravery that clearly exceed the expected call of duty, performed under extreme risk to life and with direct impact on combat operations. For an action to be considered eligible, there must be consistent testimonies, official reports, and evidence that the observed behavior was not merely courageous, but exceptional within its context. In Doss's case, this process began while the war was still ongoing. His direct superiors, including battalion and regimental officers, began compiling accounts of his performance in Okinawa. These accounts were not limited to a single episode but covered a series of actions over several days. The central focus of the evaluation was the event that took place at the Maida escarpment, known as Hacksaw Ridge. His decision to remain at the top of the escarpment, under partial enemy control, and to continuously evacuate wounded soldiers was considered a determining factor. However, the recognition was not based solely on this isolated episode. His prior actions in campaigns such as Guam and the Philippines were also taken into account, where he had already demonstrated a consistent pattern of operating under enemy fire, in addition to receiving 2 Bronze Star medals with VIL, Device for Valor. This body of evidence contributed to the formation of a specific operational profile, a soldier who repeatedly assumed high risks to preserve the lives of others. Another relevant aspect in the evaluation was the nature of his role. As a combat medic, Doss's primary mission was not to engage the enemy. However, this did not reduce the level of risk involved. On the contrary, medics often operated in exposed areas, where the presence of wounded indicated recent combat activity. Moreover, in the Pacific Theater, there were reports that medics were, at times, deliberately targeted, which further increased the vulnerability of that role. Even within this context, Doss's actions were considered beyond what was expected for his position. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was formalized and submitted for evaluation at higher levels of military command. This process included review by high-ranking officers and rigorous document analysis. After approval, the official awards ceremony was organized. On October 12, 1945, in Washington, D.C., Harry S. Truman, then President of the United States, personally presented the Medal of Honor to Desmond Doss. The ceremony took place just a few months after the end of the war, at a time when the country was still processing the outcomes of the global conflict. The selection of Doss as one of the honorees of that period was not only an individual recognition, but also reflected the type of narrative the government sought to highlight in the post-war era. During the presentation, Truman addressed Doss directly, emphasizing the value of his actions. Although statements in such ceremonies typically follow protocol, records indicate that the president expressed genuine admiration in this particular case. One aspect that distinguishes Doss from many other Medal of Honor recipients is the nature of his actions. A large portion of awards at this level is associated with direct combat actions, often involving the neutralization of enemy positions under adverse conditions. In Doss's case, the recognition was granted for rescue actions, a less common type of contribution in this context. This does not mean his contribution was considered lesser. On the contrary, his ability to operate repeatedly under enemy fire, without carrying a weapon, to rescue fellow soldiers was interpreted as a level of courage equivalent to or even greater than that required in offensive actions. Another important element was his status as a conscientious objector. Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II. This fact carries significant institutional implications. Historically, conscientious objectors were not always well understood within the armed forces. Their presence raised questions about discipline, reliability, and integration within combat units. The recognition of Doss contributed, at least partially, to changing that perception. He demonstrated that it was possible to maintain personal convictions, including the refusal to carry weapons without compromising operational effectiveness. More than that, he showed that such convictions could coexist with high levels of performance in combat situations. From a historical perspective, his case became a reference point in discussions about military ethics, diversity of beliefs within the armed forces, and the role of non-combat functions in wartime scenarios. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Doss was formally recognized as a corporal in the United States Army. His promotion reflected not only time in service but also acknowledgement of his actions. In addition to the Medal of Honor, he had accumulated other distinctions, including the previously mentioned Bronze Stars and other decorations related to his service in the Pacific. However, despite the official recognition, the transition to the post-war period would present new challenges. The end of World War II in 1945 marked a significant transition for millions of military personnel returning to civilian life. For many, this process involved psychological adjustment, reintegration into the workforce, and the rebuilding of routines disrupted by the conflict. In the case of Desmond Doss, this transition was particularly complex due to the direct physical consequences of his service in the war theater. Despite surviving the most intense combat of the Pacific Campaign, Doss returned to the United States in a weakened state of health. During his service, he had contracted tuberculosis, an infectious disease that, at the time, still posed a significant challenge to medicine, especially in advanced cases. The diagnosis came after his return, and treatment required a prolonged period of hospitalization. For approximately 5.5 years, Doss underwent intensive medical care. Tuberculosis treatment during that period included invasive procedures, often involving the removal of affected lung tissue to halt the progression of the disease. As a result, he lost a lung and 5 ribs. This intervention had a permanent impact on his respiratory capacity. Even after clinical recovery, Doss lived with significant physical limitations, including difficulty performing activities that required prolonged exertion. In 1951, he was discharged from the hospital with a disability rating estimated at around 90%, indicating the extent of his functional impairment. These limitations directly affected his professional plans. Before the war, Doss had worked as a carpenter, an occupation requiring physical strength, endurance, and mobility. After treatment, it became virtually impossible for him to resume that profession in its original form. Faced with this reality, he had to restructure his life. Using resources from his disability pension, he purchased a small rural property in the region of Rising Fawn in the state of Georgia. There, he established a routine centered on subsistence farming and activities compatible with his physical limitations. This period represents an important shift in his life trajectory. While his wartime experience was marked by intensity and constant risk, his civilian life followed a more stable rhythm, though still constrained by health restrictions. On a personal level, Doss maintained his family life. He had married Dorothy Pauline Schutt in 1942, shortly before being sent into active service. In 1946, the couple had a son, Desmond Tommy Doss Jr. The presence of his family played a significant role in this adaptation process. Life on a rural property, with agricultural work and domestic routines, provided a relatively stable environment after years of exposure to extreme situations. However, his health challenges did not end in the immediate post-war period. Over the following decades, Doss faced additional medical complications. In 1976, after prolonged use of antibiotics, part of earlier treatments, he developed a condition that resulted in total hearing loss. This side effect, although rare, is associated with certain medications used to treat severe infections. Deafness represented another major limitation, affecting his communication and social interaction. For more than a decade, Doss lived without hearing. Only in 1988, with advances in medical technology, did he undergo a procedure to implant a hearing device. This type of intervention, known as a cochlear implant, converts sound signals into electrical stimuli interpreted by the nervous system. After the procedure, Doss regained part of his hearing ability, improving his quality of life. Despite these difficulties, he maintained an active presence in his religious community. As a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he continued to participate in community activities, religious events, and social initiatives. He also began sharing his wartime experiences in educational and institutional settings. These accounts were not driven by self-promotion. On the contrary, Doss often downplayed the extent of his actions. On several occasions, he stated that he had rescued around 50 men in Okinawa, a number lower than the official estimate by the United States Army, which placed it at approximately 75. This discrepancy illustrates a recurring aspect of his character, a tendency to avoid exaggeration or inflated personal attribution. Another important aspect of his post-war life was the ongoing public recognition he received. In addition to the Medal of Honor, his name became associated with various commemorative initiatives. One example occurred in 1990, when a stretch of highway in the state of Georgia was designated the Desmond T. Doss Medal of Honor Highway. This type of recognition reflects the consolidation of his image as a historical figure, not only in the military context, but also in civilian life. However, his personal life was also marked by loss. In 1991, his wife Dorothy died in a car accident while traveling for medical treatment related to cancer. This event had a profound impact on his life, bringing to an end a marriage that had lasted nearly 5 decades. 2 years later, in 1993, Doss remarried, this time to Frances May Duman. This new marriage marked the final phase of his life, characterized by greater emotional stability despite ongoing physical limitations. Throughout this period, he remained relatively discreet regarding public exposure. Although his story was known in military and religious circles, it had not yet reached widespread international recognition. That would begin to change only in the following decades, with the production of documentaries, and, later, films based on his life. In the final decades of his life, Desmond Doss maintained a routine defined by discretion and a consistent adherence to the principles that had guided him since his youth. Unlike many decorated veterans, he did not seek constant public attention or build an identity centered on military recognition. His post-war life remained focused on family, religious practice, and community involvement. Even so, as time passed, his story gradually gained greater visibility. From the 1990s into the early 2000s, there was growing interest in documenting the accounts of World War II, veterans, particularly those involved in experiences considered outside the norm. In this context, Doss's life began to be recorded in a more systematic way. An important milestone was the documentary, The Conscientious Objector, released in 2004. The film features interviews with Doss himself, along with testimonies from fellow soldiers, offering a direct perspective on events that took place in the Pacific Theater. This type of documentation is significant because it preserves not only the facts, but also the participants' own interpretations. In Doss's case, these accounts reinforce traits evident throughout his life, a simple, understated way of recounting events, and a tendency to attribute his actions to external factors, especially his faith. At the same time, his health continued to require attention. The respiratory limitations resulting from the loss of a lung persisted throughout his adult life. As he aged, these difficulties intensified, gradually reducing his mobility and physical capacity. Even so, he remained active within his limits, attending religious events and veterans gatherings whenever possible. In the early 2000s, his health declined more sharply. Respiratory issues became more frequent, requiring continuous medical care. On March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, Desmond Doss passed away at his home in Piedmont due to complications associated with these conditions. His death marked the conclusion of a life that had spanned some of the most intense periods of the 20th century, including the most expansive war in modern history. He was laid to rest at Chattanooga National Cemetery, a burial site reserved for United States military veterans. This choice reflects institutional recognition of his service, placing him within a collective space of remembrance dedicated to those who served in armed conflicts. After his death, the consolidation of his legacy gained new momentum. In 2016, his story reached the big screen with the release of Hacksaw Ridge, directed by Mel Gibson and starring Andrew Garfield. The film achieved widespread international recognition and received multiple award nominations, including at the Academy Awards. The production played a significant role in introducing Doss's story to a broader audience. However, as is often the case with cinematic adaptations, certain elements were dramatized for narrative purposes. Even so, the essence of the central events, especially his actions during the Battle of Okinawa, was preserved based on historical records. From a historiographical perspective, Doss's case presents characteristics that make it relevant across multiple fields of study. First, he is frequently cited in discussions of military ethics. His refusal to carry a weapon, combined with active participation in combat, challenges conventional interpretations of a soldier's role in war. Second, his life is often examined in studies of conscientious objectors. During World War II, tens of thousands of individuals were classified under this category, but few directly participated in combat operations with significant impact. In this sense, Doss stands out as a singular case. Additionally, his actions are analyzed within the history of military medicine. The role of combat medics, especially in high-intensity environments like the Pacific Theater, involves unique challenges. Providing care under enemy fire, evacuating the wounded under adverse conditions, and making rapid decisions with limited resources. Doss's actions in Okinawa are often cited as an extreme example of these conditions. Another important aspect is the impact of his conduct on internal perceptions within the armed forces. Initially viewed with skepticism, he ultimately became a respected figure within his unit, demonstrating that operational effectiveness can take forms different from traditional expectations. From a quantitative standpoint, his achievements also remain remarkable. It is estimated that he saved approximately 75 soldiers during the events at Hacksaw Ridge, although there are variations in this number. Regardless of the exact figure, historical consensus holds that his actions directly contributed to the survival of dozens of men. This was accomplished without the use of offensive weaponry, a factor that underscores the uniqueness of his story. Finally, his legacy can also be understood in symbolic terms. The image of a soldier who took part in one of the most violent conflicts in history without firing a single shot presents a narrative that contrasts with more conventional models of military heroism. This narrative does not replace other forms of participation in war, but it broadens the spectrum of behaviors recognized as meaningful within that context. In summary, the story of Desmond Doss is not limited to a set of isolated episodes. It represents the intersection of personal conviction, historical context, and practical action under extreme conditions. Throughout his life, he maintained a consistent line of conduct from childhood to his final years. This continuity is one of the key elements that explain the enduring relevance of his story in historical studies. And it is precisely this consistency between belief, decision, and action that ensures his name remains part of the lasting memory of World War II. If you made it this far, thank you for staying until the end. Content like this takes time, research, and dedication to produce. If you found this analysis valuable, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support is what makes it possible to continue creating in-depth historical content like this.